In this video, we will go over some behavioral systems like nepotism, amoral familism, and ethnocentrism. We will go over how these values are connected, and most importantly, we will present exceptional cases where these behaviors become needed and warranted, and where these behaviors are unwarranted. After going over conflict of interest, we will go over the next biggest lapse of concern, which is nepotism. Other instances like abusive behavior, safety violations, corruption, discrimination, and sexual harassment are rather obvious and well understood. Since nepotism is the jumping off point to amoral familism and ethnocentrism, allow us to think about what nepotism means. From the Oxford English Dictionary, nepotism is the practice among those with power or influence of favoring relatives or friends, especially by giving them jobs. Of course, nepotism also can be engaged in by people who do not have power and influence, but let's ask ourselves, what are some examples of nepotism? Some examples of nepotism illustrating acts of nepotism are the following, but they're not confined to them. The first one is a relative gives a job opportunity or favorable treatment to their own relative, depriving more deserving or qualified candidates. Another example is a friend gives a job or an opportunity or favorable treatment to their own friend, depriving more deserving or qualified candidates. After viewing these examples, the viewer is likely to be unhappy with the practice of nepotism, and they're likely to demand an end to nepotism, and more than likely, they're going to ask for the institution of meritocracy. But meritocracy is often an acceptable excuse for preventing favorable outcomes for the quote-unquote undesirable elements. If the viewer is sanctimonious or incensed over the inequity of nepotism, and if they are for merit, they would do well to recall that merit is oft used as a gatekeeper to filter out any undesirable, unhealthy, or oppressed peoples, because the oppressed often do not have the good fortune or resources to attain excellence. As a result, you will see quite often, or more often than we do, or we ought to, we will see examples of healthy and attractive people who do an adequate job. They are preferred to unhealthy and unattractive people who may do a better job. So after seeing that healthy and attractive but adequate people are preferable to unhealthy and unattractive people who only do a better job, we may also note that with the advances in automation, most roles and job descriptions are becoming dispensable, meaning a human being is no longer required in those roles. This dispensability allows people to pick someone based on a criteria that have little to do with merit. So with the advances in automation, people people no longer have to rely on competence because a machine can be competent. And as a result, because competence and merit is less valuable, um, that is an outcome of automation. The viewer will see that this is actually good for humankind. This is because merit was used as an excuse to engage in nepotism. Why is that? Because the healthy and wealthy and well-connected were and are most likely to enjoy insider information and resources and privileges which are going to make them more likely to enjoy merit or excellence in a narrow field of endeavor. Now we may ask, what could be the reason for the start of nepotism? What are the roots of nepotism? So historically, all human endeavor has been to allow the quote unquote healthy and desirable people to reproduce by entering the gene pool. On the other hand, and very understandably, people have had the goal of discouraging the unhealthy and undesirable people from passing their physiopathologies and their psychopathologies to the next generation. Obviously, the viewer would agree, no one wants to see one generation after another pass on diseases to the next. Now, to facilitate the reproduction of healthy and desirable civilizations, people have often showered the healthy and desirable people with wealth and favorable outcomes. This has allowed them to easily enter the gene pool because they're healthy and desirable in the first place. You're going to get a healthier next generation. On the other hand, in order to discourage reproduction for the unhealthy and undesirable who may possess hereditary diseases or hereditary psychopathologies, people have tended to afflict them with poverty and disfavor or unfavorable outcomes. This makes it harder for the unhealthy or undesirable to reproduce, allegedly. This was part of the Malthusian economic doctrine, but obviously it hasn't worked because we see a lot of people with health issues and a lot of unhealthy people outnumbering, unfortunately, one to many outnumbering the healthy. Because the wealthy and healthy are more likely to exhibit merit and excellence, merit has traditionally been used as an excuse or an indicator for entry into the gene pool. On the other hand, since the poor and unhealthy are deprived of the resources, the well-being, and the environment required for exhibiting merit, they are less likely to excel in certain areas, and this is often used as a reason for depriving them from favorable outcomes like wealth and health. In this way, merit is become an indicator of health and desirability. Merit is, in other words, not just an indicator, it's a gatekeeper. And like most indicators and gatekeepers, merit often fails in doing an adequate job. Unfortunately, merit may be defined so narrowly today that it completely ignores genetic health. And that allows people to circumvent and undermine merit. Especially the overperforming, unhealthy, and undesirable minorities from developing countries continually exhibit that they can engage in meritorious performance even though they may be genetically unhealthy. For example, nowadays the oppressed and genetically compromised Mongoloid and Australoid and mestizos are able to circumvent the merit requirement. Another example nowadays is, for example, the Mongoloid races, despite their genetic composition and their historical oppression, are able to overcome barriers related to IQ or intelligence quotients, which was usually an indicator of merit. And that has allowed them entry into universities and professions, and they have often used merit and IQ as an excuse to gain entry into Western institutions. So what is a civilization to do when merit as a gatekeeper is undermined? So now we come to one of the root causes of nepotism and why it exists. When barriers to entry fall, human civilization may come up with workarounds to ensure that mostly the healthy and desirable continue to reproduce. If nepotism is removed, some other gatekeeper will be introduced, because the right thing to do is to only introduce the healthiest and most desirable elements to the human gene pool and to life's gene pool. Only the most benign and the most loving and the most healthy and desirable life forms are meant to go on reproducing. If a life form is unhealthy, it's passing hereditary diseases, or it's non-benign and it's hurting or harming others, then ideally no one wants them to reproduce. People want them to first become healthy. This leads to a solution to nepotism and to many other systems that are presently employed. The viewer may be exasperated that there exists a mechanism or system meant to exclude people. But exclusion and inclusion are both meant for advancing human psychological and physiological and moral health and felicity and desirability. Once we understand the point of exclusion and inclusion, which is to advance the health and experience of living as a human being, we stumble upon a solution to all these systems like meritocracies and nepotistic systems. Nepotism and merit and all other gates are removed if the unhealthy and undesirable in this instance are first become healthy and desirable. If everyone cooperates with one another to first become healthy and desirable, all these contests over entry are ended. The unhealthy have to have the courage and the self-confidence and the righteousness to take the right course of action. In other words, righteous, selfless conduct often leads to freedom for everyone. Unfortunately, instead of becoming healthy and desirable, people try to become meritorious, and they try to bypass a change to a healthy genotype and phenotype. Instead of going through this route, they go straight for merit. This is unfortunately essentially undermining the core function of merit as a gatekeeper, which is to discriminate between the healthy and the unhealthy, the desirable and the undesirable. When you undermine the core function of merit, merit is replaced with behaviors like nepotism. And when nepotism becomes a gatekeeper, other social practices or vices arise, such as social climbing. We see evidence of this throughout history, but particularly most recently with the betrothal of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry, and the practice of miscegenation, and even in literature, stories like that of Barry Lyndon. Previously, we asked for unhealthy and undesirable people to become healthy and desirable first, instead of becoming merely meritorious, since a merit is merely an indicator and a gatekeeper. An understandable but incorrect reaction of one to many unhealthy and unfortunately oppressed peoples has been, unfortunately, to try to stress to everyone that they are, in fact, healthy and desirable, and everyone should ignore any signs of lack of health or desirability. We propose that when merit as an indicator is undermined, there are other worse gatekeepers that take its place, like nepotism and its accompanying vices. So, the inestimable Professor Robert Putnam of Harvard Kennedy School of Government um, wrote about racial disparity in health and desirability um, as a contributor to low trust societies. This means that if we bring about xanthocroid racial homogeneity, we are likely to have higher trust societies and hence fewer to no gatekeepers. There is unfortunately an opposing, rather misguided counter thought. So, when Professor Robert Putnam proposed that racial homogeneity may lead to higher trust societies and fewer um, or less or absolutely no gatekeepers, we added that a xanthocroid racial homogeneity would lead to a better, higher trust societies with fewer gates. At this point, an opposing defensive reactionary view understandably says that it's particularly voiced by, unfortunately, by one too many unhealthy and undesirable folk who claim that, well, we are already healthy and desirable, just stop discriminating against us. So we also see people like Professor Eric Uzlana, uh, who feel that the problem is with discrimination and that society needed to take a leap of faith and trust first. However, there are many social problems with this performative act, where the citizens trust by sheer force of willpower or force themselves to trust the unhealthy and undesirable people who have been oppressed. If you will see our video on performative and affirmative utterances, we admit that there is a place for performative sentiments, for insincere sentiments. Even there might be a place for trust that is performative, but it ought to be clarified with qualifiers and modifiers so as to serve the cause of justice and not end up undermining it. To understand why performative trust may be counterproductive, it is helpful to understand the origins of race. Initially, Earth had one climate, and the Earth was called a pangeastic Earth, and everyone had one genotype and phenotype. Then some people began to harm others who were healthy, and this resulted literally in mutated genes and unhealthy people. An example of such harm is, of course, the classic overexposure to solar or UV radiation, which literally edits or mutates your genes. Overexposure and chronic exposure can result in this mutation or unhealth passing to the next generation. So once someone is harmed at a genetic level and they become unhealthy at a genetic level, when they reproduce, their children inherit that trait. This inherited trait and continued exposure to chronic harm results in the creation of a group of people sharing genetic evidence of harm. This group of people sharing genetic evidence of mutations or harm may be called a race of people. Whereas a group of people who remain unmolested or who are healthy form another race of people. For purposes of this discussion, we will call such harm to human beings race harm, which is the act of turning a healthy people by oppressing them into an unhealthy people so that their unhealth descends all the way to their genetic code. There is historical and theological evidence of the origins of race harm. Historically, theologically speaking, the practice of race harms is said to have started around 200 years after the flood, in the age of Peleg. Peleg was incidentally a descendant of Noah. He lived in days when the earth was divided into 3 climate zones. In Noah's time, the earth was pangeastic. There was one climate and one continent, one landmass, and one human race. Then the practice of race harm started in the age of Peleg, 200 years after the flood. Noah was still alive, and there were 3 climate zones created. We go into detail about this in the videos on upstream and downstream civilizations. For the purposes of this discussion, one of the zones that are important that we'll talk about that was created was called Hades in ancient Greek, and which is basically translated to hell. and that is the region of the tropics and the equatorial belt. And Hades in ancient Greece and hell in modern lingo is characterized by heat. Now you may ask, why is heck hot? Well, it helps to make healthy people unhealthy. So heck is hot because heat increases viral and bacterial growth, and that helps to make people unhealthy and consequently undesirable. If you are in a lower level of heck, you are likely to encounter both heat and humidity. Humidity increases, and this increase results in increased viral and bacterial transmission. Viral and bacterial growth and transmission result in greater transmission of unhealth and perpetuation of unhealthy people. Overexposure to heat and humidity also results in stigmatization. And this is the most important part. This overexposure to solar and UV radiation results in stigmatization or an adaptation known as burnt skin, which is the melanated skin or burnt, darker skin of people, and the creation of an entire race of people who are exhibiting exposure to such extreme levels of heat and humidity. Now, most importantly, the overexposure to solar and UV radiation results in stigmatization, which is Latin for burnt skin. The heat also results in inflammation to the point that it melts the cartilage in the human nose, and this results in the nose becoming large and amorphous or misshapen. That is why you see an Australoid people with large and misshapen noses. Moreover, the heat and humidity also renders straight blonde hair dark or frizzy or curly, as you may see in peoples who have suffered from overexposure to solar radiation in the tropical and equatorial belt. Most alarmingly, overexposure to solar radiation results in sunburn, which drastically lowers immunity, leaving the victim vulnerable to contagious diseases in an already contagious environment. As we went over, heat and humidity increases viral and bacterial growth as well as viral and bacterial transmission, and then the heat also lowers your immunity. To recap, we understand that chronic harm or overexposure to solar radiation results in mutation reaching the germline cells. These mutated genes mean that the harm, trauma, or unhealth has reached a genetic level, which means that unhealth is now hereditary. Signs of this trauma become hereditary. And when unhealth is hereditary and is encoded in the germline cells or the cell's DNA, then we may safely say that health may spread by reproduction. Now, of course, we may ask, how can we reverse race harm uh, and stop the spread of unhealthy and undesirable traits? How do we bring the people back from unhealth and undesirability to health and desirability? An attempt at race improvement may explain, or previous historical attempts may explain why performative trust is not very helpful. So let us also ask ourselves, how may we halt the spread of the unhealthy and make the people healthy and desirable? So previously we went over an obvious path to raising people up. Uh, we went over this earlier. We said that it's important to take the unhealthy and undesirable people and make them healthy and desirable first, after which they may freely court and have offspring with the healthy and desirable folk if there are resources available for reproduction. Uh, Now, in the past, this has been tried um, because as in any medical area, any hospital, if you have somebody who is unhealthy, you quarantine them and make them healthy first, and once they're healthy, you let them join the general population. This quarantine was evidenced by previous attempts of quarantining people by segregating people and implementing separatist laws in the past, um, and even present in some areas. This segregation or setting people apart is famously known as apartheid, implemented in some parts of the world. Unfortunately, it was not implemented properly, and as a result, we have given quarantining people and making them healthy a bad name. And we'll go over why apartheid got a bad name. The previous attempts at race improvement or quarantining people did not work so well. Because the unhealthy and the undesirable were often allowed to reproduce despite being ostensibly in quote unquote quarantined ghettos or barrios, right? If a person has a contagious disease or they have a disease that is hereditary, usually you bring them to a hospital, you make them healthy, and when they're healthy, they can join the rest of the public. But if you keep them in a hospital, but they keep reproducing and increasing in numbers, they're eventually going to break out through the quarantine and join the healthy and desirable general population, whether they're healthy or not, and then spread the contagion. Now, quarantines work if you actively reduce the number of unhealthy and undesirable people. But if you quarantine people and they keep reproducing, then they'll eventually break through this quarantine, right? So, what are the steps to race improvement? The correct way of doing quarantining people apartheid is, first of all, ending further race harm. So first of all, making sure that people who are harming others and making them unhealthy, they're prevented, and measures are taken to keep people healthy. Then the second step is actually, when people are in quarantine, actually trying to make them healthy and desirable instead of using them as slave labor, or instead of working them to death or flogging them or bringing them further into sunshine and making them even more unhealthy in heat and oppressing them with menial and manual labor, right? That is a recipe for like breaking the quarantine and causing people to be more unhealthy, remaining unhealthy. That um, that should be like common sense, right? And then the third step is prohibiting the spread or increase in numbers of unhealthy and undesirable by regulating the reproduction of the race harmed. So you do not want the unhealthy and undesirable, slaves or people you are already oppressing. You don't want them reproducing. But apparently, not only were they allowed to reproduce, there were healthy people who would um, like have mixed race children with them and engage in acts of miscegenation. And that's even worse because now you are truly breaking the quarantine, and by pretending that there is some kind of quarantine and actually oppressing people now. And the quarantine becomes like an oppressive area where you're like sexually exploiting these people, and you're exploiting them for their labor, and you're exploiting them for your own sexual gratification. And that's not a good thing. Obviously not good for the healthy people. It's definitely not good for the unhealthy people, right? Unfortunately, all too few of these measures were not implemented which often broke the quarantine. And it resulted in not only the spread of the race harmed, but in making the healthy and desirable xanthocroid populations a minority, and eventually dragging the race and flora and fauna of entire regions. Case in point, historically speaking, is ancient Israel, ancient Greece, Spain under the North African rule, and much of the world that is now Melanochroid or Australoid or Mongoloid, including Africa, India, South and Central America, and the Far East. Recall that the Earth was Pangeastic and populated by a healthy and desirable xanthocroid people. But today, because race harm is not ended and we're not healing the unhealthy and the undesirable, and we're not managing the reproduction of the unhealthy and undesirable, and as well as the healthy and desirable, whose reproduction often ends up creating pressures for greater harm. Because we're not doing those things, the xanthocroid population is a minority, globally speaking, unfortunately. The breach in quarantine allows for some benefits. Unfortunately, it results in short-term relief for the unhealthy and undesirable. Breaking quarantine is likely to be an attractive option for unhealthy and undesirable people, because when you're suffering, you cannot really make informed and judicious decisions that are beneficial for your welfare and for human welfare. And just being out of quarantine feels like freedom and feels like really nice, but in the long term, it is injurious to the general human population. For one-to-many race harmers, a breach in quarantine is beneficial because it allows them to exploit the unhealthy and undesirable. They may do this by hiding the fact that the unhealthy and undesirable are in need of healing first. Instead of these race harmers and exploiters offering the unhealthy and undesirable healing and justice, restoration and compensation, the race harmer and exploiter will attempt to portray the harmed and unhealthy non-white folk as equal to the healthy and desirable folk, like the xanthocroid folk. They create this illusion so that they may more easily exploit them and prevent them from getting the necessary healing and respite and rest and loving care that the unhealthy and undesirable need, as well as the healthy and desirable need. Because unhealthy race harmed people are deluded into thinking that they're equal to the healthy, privileged, and better off people, the race harmer and oppressors can more easily exploit the uninformed, and they create suffering that results in a continual conflict between the races and between people, and it sharpens individuals into ways of conflict, depriving them of their innocence, humanity, and dignity. This creates a society rife with microaggressions and informal feedback in the form of discriminatory practices, which are further aggravated by anti-discrimination legislation, perhaps. Now, this brings us to further delve into how performative trust is not ideal, and discriminatory feedback in its present crude form is a result of such deliberate illusions and obscurantist and obfuscating measures which attempt to portray the unhealthy and undesirable races as equal to the healthy and desirable races. As we mentioned earlier, one of the major concerns with trusting first is that it is not an organic sentiment and it must be conjured up or promoted through sheer willpower. Uh, the second bigger concern is this: discrimination that is insensitive, crude, reactionary, and vague is not desirable. But even the worst form of discrimination, even if it hurts our feelings and at worst may, in the worst case scenario, may further raise harm, discrimination reminds us that we or our ancestors have been oppressed and race harmed, and hence we are not as healthy or desirable as the fortunate folk. Now, discrimination-related feedback, when delivered by a layperson, may offend or hurt a person's feelings, and it is not ideal, but it still reminds a person to ask for justice and healing from race harm. But when race harm is normalized and pervasive or widespread, uh, actual feedback about harm or discriminatory feedback is usually hurtful. Uh, and it is so hurtful that it may make the race harmed, non-white, non-xanthocroid victim of harm defensive and perhaps even irrational. Uh, we have to, as a society, be careful about discrimination further aggravating affairs. However, any feedback about discrimination ought to be welcomed so as to identify any opportunities for rehabilitation, reparations, or restoration for both the victim of race harm, the unhealthy and undesirable folk, as well as those giving the feedback in the form of discrimination. We may also want to understand why the uh, unhealthy and undesirable do not want uh, feedback in the form of discrimination. Now, discriminatory feedback is often received poorly because victims of race harm are so traumatized that they simply may not be able to handle the bitter truth revealing their harmed condition, that they have been oppressed and harmed in the past. Truth is like honeyed sweet water, but if you let drip even a drop of honeyed water on an open wound, you are likely to cause the recipient of the truth some aggravation. To victims who have suffered chronically, who are merely receiving feedback or discrimination, but not healing, more feedback can be just another drop of water falling upon the victim of, say, water drop torture. More importantly, performative trust hides the race harmers' crimes because it causes people to normalize a race harmed state. You see, it is in the interest of the race harmer if the victim confuse their race harm state for a healthy state. So when the unhealthy claim that they are healthy, it pleases the person who made them unhealthy, and they would rather agree with them. Most importantly, if discrimination as feedback is suppressed instead of acted upon to heal the unhealthy, and if the unhealthy think that they are in fact healthy, then the race harmer can then continue to make people unhealthy and undesirable. And all too few may stop the harm. Therefore, it's rather important that we do not normalize what is unhealthy because it ends up hiding race harm and allows the race harmer to continue to race harm.
Another side effect of normalizing the unhealthy or minimizing the race harm suffered by them is this: it discourages the urgency and importance of positive justice for the victims of race harm. Justice means restoration or restoring the unhealthy and undesirable to health and desirability, and compensating them for their suffering for the time that they were unhealthy and undesirable. At the same time, we must do justice to the race harmer as well. By that, we mean that we want to be also good to the race harmer. Justice for the race harmer means restoring the race harmer to the original state of man, the state of a race healer, or somebody who heals people and restores them to the xanthocroid or healthiest of races. It also means compensating the race harming criminal for the crime of race harm, because crime is a punishment unto itself. And we will take this opportunity to express our deep love and admiration for the criminal race harmer, because surely it must take a lot of patience, a lot of suffering, and a lot of courage for them to harm a fellow human being into becoming unhealthy and undesirable. So now we come to the point that if recognition of race harm, feedback to the race harmed, or treatment of the race harmed is discouraged, if race harm is accepted as a norm and race harming criminals are not rehabilitated, if the disparate races are portrayed or misportrayed as diversity, or they are portrayed as a positive, and if the above continues, then it eventually drags entire civilizations down. This is what happened to ancient Greece. It happened to the Jews in ancient Israel. This is also what happened to the now race-harmed civilizations, as each successive generation eventually becomes equally race-harmed. This is a natural outcome of punitive justice and palliative methods of reform. The solution, of course, is to not hurt people if you want to reform them. Again, as a gentle reminder that discrimination, which is sensitive and informed, is perhaps a spur towards justice. Discrimination reminds us that a crime has occurred. It is feedback which is oft given, unfortunately, once too often given out of fear for personal and social safety. And this is a natural reaction. Um, However, we would like to systematize it and make it methodical and um, make it more informed and sensitive. If discriminating feedback is given with sensitivity and empathy, it gives valuable information, namely that a crime of race harm has occurred, and someone healthy and desirable is no longer healthy and desirable, and hence we must act upon it. In this way, the person who has the courage to give discriminatory feedback, hopefully it is sensitive and empathetic, uh, is doing something for the greater good. So, gentle, sensitive, empathetic, discriminating feedback reminds us that the victim of race harm, people who are non-xanthocroid, who may be Australoid, Mongoloid, mestizos, even melanochroid. Such victims of race harm need healing, restoration, beauty, and health, while it also spurs us to compensate the victim of race harm with reparations. Lastly, gentle, sensitive, empathetic, actionable, discriminating feedback reminds everyone that the practice of race harm must end and the race harming criminal must be gently, lovingly restored to health themselves. For crime and harm is a punishment in itself, and it takes a lot of suffering and trauma for a human being to begin to harm others and use harm as a method of reform. Next, we will go over nepotism and amoral familism and its relationship with amoral familism. Next, we go over how nepotism is connected to a value that is often taken for granted, which is familism, and most importantly, amoral familism. Now, what is familism and or amoral familism? Amoral familism is putting your own family over righteousness or welfare of the larger society. Amoral familism is a social action or inaction persistently oriented to the economic interests of the nuclear family as opposed to the larger society. So as you see here, we often see people go, oh, it's you and me against the world, as in we're forming a family. But the family ends up neglecting the common good and larger social obligations, and this results in suffering for everyone. It results in social atomization or polarization and silos where people are in their own families and the outside is a mess, right? And it results often in backward societies and the devaluation of the public sphere. So a little bit of history um, about how amoral familism was observed by a social scientist, Edward Banfield, in an account of poverty in a village in southern Italy. In his seminal work, The Moral Basis of a Backwards Society, dated 1958, Edward Banfield, Harvard sociologist, argued that the backwardness of the community was to be explained largely by the inability of the villagers to act together for their common good, or indeed for any end transcending the immediate material interests of the nuclear family. This may be attributed to the ethos of amoral familism, which has been produced by prevailing mistrust due to the presence of racial disparity because of years of conflict with neighboring North Africa. Manifestations of amoral familism is the rise of parallel governments like the mafia or makeshift families like Il Familia in Sicily, where they prefer their own members over the larger society. Next, we will go over scriptural evidence urging you to value righteousness over familial ties. I avoid providing scriptural evidence because people go around and change it and then claim that it is because the word of God is quote unquote alive and scripture wanted to be changed. But if scripture must change, we hope it changes for the better. And I'm giving this particular quote because this is the prevailing morality of the foremost civilization on this planet, which is part of the Abrahamic faith, which is Judeo-Christian and Islamic faith. They all, well, actually, the Christians and the Muslims in particular hold
this particular scripture holy, and the Jews have similar beliefs as well. So Jesus Christ, for example, says um, in this first passage that I'm going to quote, he basically encourages you to follow divine teachings over self-interest and family interest. He goes, anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. That's just one of the passages. Further, the prophet Jesus Christ promises rewards for those who are selfless and set aside familial interest for human and divine service. He goes, and everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or fathers or mothers or wives or children or fields for my sake will receive 100 times as much and will inherit eternal life. Basically, he says to prefer uh, to prefer the path of and the teachings of a prophet over your houses and your brothers and sisters and fathers and mothers and possessions and families. He also goes on to say that whoever does God's will is my brother and sister and mother. In other words, he's speaking of a human family, of a larger human family as opposed to merely a nuclear family. Of course, these teachings fall aside when people use them or misuse them to advance their own ethnic and their own agenda, right? Now, before we move to discussing familism further, I'd like to remind the viewer about context when it comes to morality. Um, I've said it before, and I'll say it again, that when discussing morality, we must remind the viewer that everything has context. One man's um, virtue is another man's vice or ethical lapse, right? For example, a poor man must save money, and frugality in that case becomes a virtue. But if a wealthy man saves liquid assets, even though they have a lot of money, millions and billions and trillions, then that wealthy man may be called miserly or tight-fisted, and that's a vice. Um, Again, context is important when it comes to even to spending money. If a poor man spends money, it may be called profligacy, right? But if a wealthy man uh, uh, chooses to spend generously in a charitable and quote unquote entrepreneurial fashion, then this generosity is a virtue. Now, I'd like to point out that even though familism can be amoral, in some circumstances, familism might be valid. There is a time for familism, and in some unfortunate contexts, familism does become moral, and it is when you are truly the foremost family in an unfortunate surrounding. Historical examples include Lot's family. They were the chosen, Lot and his family were the chosen righteous few to be spared the destruction befalling the city of Sodom. Despite having every reason for Lot to exhibit familism, a truly righteous family like that of Lot preferred the safety of the righteous visitor, the good angels, over their own safety and the safety of his own family. If the viewer recalls, when the city of Sodom was about to be destroyed, and right before they were destroyed, they were banging on Lot's door to surrender the visitors that had arrived in their town, Lot, the prophet Lot, offered his own daughters in exchange for the safety of the visitors. Perhaps moral familism does not mean always putting your own family first. It is always about doing the right thing. However, there are modern day examples where the right thing is to preserve your own family. For example, the presence of a European Xanthocroid family settler colonizing a predominantly non-Xanthocroid region. So if your family is the healthiest family and they are surrounded by oppressed and unhealthy people in a toxic and polluted environment, um, then of course familism becomes not only moral but an obligation for the sake of preserving the health of the few people who happen to be your family. This particular example gives us insight into the causes and even solutions to familism. If the viewer has viewed the other videos, we go over how the practice of race harm results in racial disparity, and racial disparity provokes financial and cultural disparity, and that results in that particular disparity results in low trust societies, and that leads to attempts at amoral familism. This is what Edward Banfield observed in Sicily in the 1950s, because in those days, Sicily was still recuperating from the North African invasions, and its population was still recovering. And in some cases, in some ways, Sicily is even today sees signs of the depredations caused by the invasions of the Moors. The solution, of course, is to end race harm and engage in race improvement, resulting in a homogeneously healthy or xanthocroid society. The resulting racial equality and homogeneity is likely to result in lower levels of disparity, be it financial or cultural. Again, I'm not talking about any homogeneity. I'm talking about the highest form, a healthy homogeneity. You want good homogeneity, and you want bad heterogeneity. If you have to have anything bad, it better be heterogeneous. Not everyone should suffer from the bad things. But if you have something good going, everyone should enjoy it, and it should be homogeneous. So if there is a standard of health, and if people are healthy, then everybody should be equally healthy. This in turn is likely to create, not only likely, we have observed that it creates higher trust societies, as in certain parts of Europe before the refugee and migrant influx. It creates higher trust societies which are more likely to trust their leaders, be it their parents, their teachers, or people in positions of authority like politicians and policemen and their monarchs. And this is likely to result in lifting a society out of the disadvantages of democracies or worse. Now we come to one of the ethical concerns related to nepotism and amoral familism, which is ethnocentrism. In the Webster Dictionary, ethnocentrism is defined as the attitude that one's own group, ethnicity, or nationality is superior to others. So it should be clear to the viewer that ethnocentrism is the duty of the healthy and fortunate, and it is a vice for the unhealthy and oppressed unfortunates. And the viewer may be puzzled and ask why? How is that possible? How is it a virtue for the healthy and a vice for the unhealthy? we must promote, share, and impart what good we enjoy to others for the benefit of others. So if you are healthy and beautiful and fortunate, you must promote your ethnicity in a nice and kind way without humiliating others, obviously. And ethnocentrism in that case becomes an obligation. On the other hand, if you are unhealthy and oppressed, you must discourage the creation of and perpetuation of harm and oppression and disease and illness, and hence the byproduct of harm and oppression and disease and illness, which is your ethnic genotype. People who are unhealthy and oppressed may not promote their own unfortunate traumatized ethnicity, but if they are righteous and if they want to do the right thing, they may ask for an end to such trauma and wrongs and ethnicities, and which are byproduct of such oppression and poverty and toxicity. Once again, context is important. If someone engages in ethnocentrism, but they are unhealthy and they are going to pass hereditary diseases on to the next generation, then ethnocentrism in their case becomes at best performative and can create harm by misleading and providing justification of race harm. Hence, it's a vice. And we can go into more detail about this. We will further illustrate with examples how one value can be a virtue for one person and a vice for another. So previously, we saw that if you are healthy and you believe that others may aspire to and enjoy your level of superior genetic health, then it is a right belief to embrace and a virtuous position to take because you are healthy. However, if you are unhealthy and you believe that others may aspire to and enjoy your level of disease and genetic hereditary conditions, then it is a wrong belief to hold and a vicious position to take, particularly if you are somebody who is deluding themselves into thinking you are healthy when you're not. As a further example of illustrating context, suppose you are a learned and knowledgeable person and you hold a value that says you would like others to aspire to and enjoy your level of superior knowledge and correct ideas. If that is your value system, then it is the right belief to embrace and a virtuous position to take. However, if you are ignorant and you have incorrect beliefs, for you to aspire to and enjoy, for you to aspire, have others aspire to and enjoy your level of misguided ignorance is a wrong value to hold, and it is a vicious position to take. In other words, if you are learned and rightly guided, you embrace your privileged position and you gently and lovingly teach others how to reach that position. However, if you are unfortunate and ignorant, you become learned first and then you help others reach your level of knowledge. The same thing with health and unhealth and your genetic composition. If you are healthy, it is right to help others become as healthy as you are. If you are unhealthy, then first you must become healthy, and then you can help others reach your level of health. But before that, if you are unhealthy and somebody has misled you, or you are believing that that everyone should be as diseased as you, then that is a vicious position to take. We'll look at one last example to illustrate how one value can be a virtue for one person and a vice for another. If you are wealthy and you are financially well off, and you believe that others should also aspire to and enjoy your level of superior financial well-being, then it is a right belief to embrace. You are wealthy, you want others to be wealthy. You are learned, you want others to be knowledgeable as well. You're healthy, you want others to be healthy. That is a good position to take. It's a virtuous position. However, if you are poor and for some reason you're suffering from poverty and still believe that others should aspire to your level of poverty and enjoy similar levels of lack and privation, and somehow you are okay with that, then it is a wrong belief to hold, and it is a vicious position to take. First, if you want to hold such a position, you must first try to try to become wealthy, and then others become wealthy, right? But you can't be poor and ignorant and unhealthy and then uh, think it is okay to live like that and help and uh, and get others to be like that. Then that's a vicious take, right? There are people who are deluded. May God guide them and lovingly um, lead them to the right path. We're not holding them with contempt when we say they hold a vicious position. We still have love for them, but we want everyone to know that if you have uh, an unfortunate circumstance, you should not try to share that misfortune and spread that misfortune, right? You should try to like um, help become fortunate yourself and help others become fortunate. Now, this is all with regards to showing you that ethnocentrism is appropriate for the healthy. Now, one last returning to ethnocentrism to drive home this important point. If you are the healthiest person, or if you are one of a group of people who are healthy, and none compare to you, and you truthfully proclaim, I am healthy and hence in matters of health superior to the unhealthy, then it is a right belief to embrace and a virtuous position to take, notwithstanding any accusations of arrogance. And hopefully, you recognize this truth by being nice to others, and you don't humiliate the unhealthy and you don't hurt the unhealthy, but you recognize that you have something good going for you and you want that for others. However, if suppose you are unhealthy and you are under the illusion, or you performatively or insincerely proclaim that I am the healthiest and hence worthy of emulation due to my superior health, then it is an incorrect belief to hold, and it is a vicious position to take, because you don't want other people getting misled and other people becoming unhealthy like you, right? You want to first become healthy, and then you may spread the good health to others. At some point, humility and reluctance becomes a vice. If you are truly enjoying blessings of health, wealth, beauty that's inner and outer. It is your duty and an obligation and your righteous calling to share and spread justice and equality and speak up and assume authority and dominion and raise others up while replacing the non-benign flora and fauna.
I appreciate your viewing this video, and if you liked the ideas herein, I hope you will follow and subscribe. Grateful for your attention.